Sophie Cunningham took a brutal hit, DJ Carrington was ejected immediately, and for a moment it looked like that would be the whole story. But then Stephanie White spoke, and somehow the backlash got even bigger. Because once fans heard how White described the play, and once people remembered her history with Carrington, this stopped being just a story about one dangerous foul. It became a bigger conversation about loyalty, optics, leadership, and why the Indiana Fever head coach ended up taking almost as much heat as the player who committed the foul. It started with a breakaway. Cunningham had open floor in front of her and a clean path to the basket. It looked routine for about a second. Then Carrington came from behind and made hard contact up high, catching Cunningham across the head and neck area as she went up to finish. Sophie hit the floor hard. The arena reacted immediately. And what made the moment even more dramatic is that Cunningham still finished the play and knocked down the free throw afterward. So, before people even got to the replay, they had already seen the image that was going to define the whole night. Cunningham taking a dangerous shot, getting up and still completing the possession. Then came the review. The officials upgraded the call to a flagrant 2 and ejected Carrington. That told you how the play looked once it was slowed down. This was no longer being treated like a normal hard foul or an awkward collision. The officials saw enough force, enough high contact, and enough danger to a player in the air to end Carrington's night right there. And the reaction inside the building was just as telling. This was a Chicago home game. But after Carrington got tossed, the crowd started chanting Sophie Cunningham's name. That is incredibly revealing. Home crowds do not usually flip like that unless the moment feels obvious. Fans will defend physical basketball. Fans will even defend dirty-looking plays when they believe the refs overreacted. But when the home crowd starts backing the opposing player, that usually means the line looked clear even in real time. So at that point, the story was already big. A dangerous hit, a flagrant 2, a visibly shaken but still composed Cunningham, and a home crowd reacting like they had just watched something go too far. That would have been enough for one night. But then the attention shifted from Carrington to Stephanie White. And that is where the story really changed, because what many fans expected from White afterward was simple. They expected a strong defense of her own player. They expected clear frustration. They expected the kind of answer head coaches usually give when one of their players takes a hard shot to the head and neck on a fast break. Instead, White's comments landed very differently. Rather than centering Cunningham, many viewers felt White's response came across as oddly understanding of Carrington. She acknowledged the foul was egregious after seeing the replay, but she also emphasized Carrington's competitiveness and made comments that many fans heard as softening the play rather than defending Sophie first. That is what triggered the backlash. Because in sports, tone matters almost as much as content. Fans are not only listening for the technical explanation, they are listening for what side you sound like you are on emotionally. And in a moment where Cunningham had clearly taken the hit, a lot of people thought White sounded too careful about Carrington and not forceful enough about her own player. That perception took off almost immediately, and once it did, the conversation got bigger than the foul itself. Suddenly, people were not just arguing about whether Carrington deserved the ejection. Most already thought she did. They were arguing about whether White had failed one of the most basic tests of leadership, showing public support for her own player in a high-emotion moment. That is why the reaction turned so strong, and it is also why Stephen A. Smith jumping in mattered. Once this moved from fan anger into national TV commentary, the story gained a second life. Stephen A. did not just criticize the foul or criticize the league atmosphere around these incidents. He zeroed in on White's explanation, especially the idea that she did not fully process the play in real time. That argument hit a nerve because it sounded unbelievable to a lot of viewers. From the outside, many people thought if everyone else saw how bad the hit was immediately, how did the head coach not sound more decisive about it afterward? That is what made the criticism stick. Not necessarily because every fan agreed with every word Stephen A. said, but because he gave a louder national voice to what a lot of Fever fans were already feeling. He turned a local frustration into a broader media story, and once that happened, people started revisiting White's comments even more closely. That is when the Carrington connection became much more important, because the thing that made White's answer feel especially complicated is that this was not some random opponent she barely knew. White had coached Carrington before. She knew her game, she knew her competitiveness, she knew her reputation as an aggressive defender. That history does not prove bad intent from White, but it absolutely changes how people hear her comments. Because once fans remember that prior connection, White's answer no longer sounds like a coach speaking neutrally about a player she just watched make a bad play. It starts sounding like a coach trying to be fair to someone she already knows well, in a moment when her own fans wanted her to be less fair and more protective of the player on her bench. That is the real tension here, and it is why calling this a secret is actually less useful than calling it what it really is: context. Important context. Context that made White's response more controversial. Context that made some fans wonder whether familiarity changed her tone. Context that turned what might have been viewed as a cautious press conference into something that felt personally disappointing to people who wanted a harder stance. And once you understand that, the backlash makes more sense. Because this was never only about whether White technically condemned the foul enough. It was about whether she sounded like someone who instinctively went to Sophie Cunningham first. Many fans thought she did not. That is the emotional core of the whole controversy, not just what she said, but what people felt she failed to say. That is why the crowd reaction and the fan criticism mattered so much. In emotionally charged sports moments, people respond fast to perceived loyalty. They notice who gets defended, who gets mentioned first, who gets empathy, and who gets language that sounds like justification. Once viewers believed White had gotten that balance wrong, every part of the reaction became harsher. And then the story kept building because Carrington herself was not entering this incident with a clean slate in the eyes of many fans. Fairly or unfairly, a lot of people were already connecting this play to previous moments involving Fever players, especially Caitlin Clark. Once that happens, one foul starts carrying more historical weight than it otherwise would. Instead of feeling like one isolated mistake, it starts feeling like another example in a pattern viewers think they have seen before. That matters because patterns change how backlash works. If fans think a player made one terrible split-second decision, they may still be furious, but they usually leave room for the story to cool down. If they think they are watching another entry in a larger trend, they react much more strongly and much more quickly. That is part of why this story stayed hot, and it is also why White's response mattered even more than usual. In a situation where many fans already believed there was broader context behind the foul, they did not want a measured answer. They wanted a clear one. So from their perspective, White did not merely sound diplomatic, she sounded misaligned with the moment. That is a hard thing for any coach to recover from publicly, because once fans believe your tone is off, every follow-up explanation sounds like cleanup instead of leadership. It starts feeling reactive rather than instinctive, and in sports, instinct is what people trust. That is why this controversy had so much staying power. It had the foul, it had the replay, it had the ejection, it had the home crowd reacting against Carrington, it had a coach's post-game answer that many fans disliked. It had a national media figure amplifying that frustration, and it had a prior White-Carrington connection that made everything feel more loaded. That is a lot of fuel for one story, and it explains why the backlash expanded the way it did. By the end of it, the foul itself was no longer the only question. The bigger question became whether White understood what her audience needed to hear in that moment, and whether her relationship history with Carrington made that harder. That is a far more complicated story than a simple Flagrant 2. It is a story about optics, about trust, about who fans believe a coach is protecting when tensions are highest. And those stories tend to last longer than the game itself, because even people who disagree on the details can usually feel when a coach's answer has missed the emotional temperature of the room. That seems to be what happened here. White may have been trying to sound measured. She may have been trying not to overstate intent. She may have been trying to speak responsibly, but that is not how a lot of people heard it. They heard distance from Sophie when they wanted force. They heard nuance about Carrington when they wanted outrage. And once Stephen A. put a spotlight on that gap, the backlash only grew. That is what makes this story so interesting. The foul created the controversy. White's response expanded it, and the previous connection with Carrington gave critics a reason to believe the response was not just awkward, but revealing. Whether that interpretation is fully fair or not, it is the interpretation that drove the conversation. And in the end, that is often what matters most in public sports controversies. Not just what happened, but which version of the story the audience decides to believe. In this case, a lot of people believed the head coach did not meet the moment. That is why Fever fans were so angry. That is why the boos became part of the conversation. That is why the media kept circling back to it. And that is why this became much bigger than one foul on one fast break. So now the real question is not whether Carrington deserved to be ejected. Most people have already decided that. The real question is whether Stephanie White made a bad situation much worse with the way she handled it afterward. Because if the foul was the spark, her response may have been the part that kept the fire going. Drop your take in the comments.